Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Policy and Practice's latest webinar. We're delighted to have so many of you here today. What we're talking about today is the impact of universal credit on rent collection. And I'm really pleased to have today really interesting speakers, and I know maybe that you saw on the holding screen, but our speaker today is Bill Irvine from Universal Credit Advice and Advocacy, and he's going to be talking with my colleague Zoe Charlesworth and also Deven Ghelani. Delighted to have so many of you here on the call today, so thank you for joining us. So as I say, the webinar is titled Understanding the Impact of Universal Credit on Rent Collection. Now, before we get into the meat of the webinar, I'm just going to take you through a tiny bit of housekeeping, if I may, and just to introduce you to the panel on the right-hand side. Just to say there that if you could raise your digital hand for me so I can do an audio check, that would be fantastic. And while you're doing that, let me remind you, please, to do ask questions in the panel on the right-hand side. There's going to be a lot of detail here, and I no doubt that you're going to have loads of questions for Zoe and for Bill. So put your questions into the panel as they come to you. We've got a big chunk of time at the end to go through all of those. I have a poll, which we'll be getting to shortly, and there will be a survey at the end of the webinar. And we will have you on your way by 11:30. So thank you very much, everybody, for letting me know that you can hear us. I'd just like to, I mentioned there that our speakers today are Zoe and Bill and Deven. And really what, as you can see on the screen, what I wanted to do is just to put a face to the name, just because it's always nice to do that. Zoe, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Hi, everyone.
Deven, would you like to say hello? Deven must have muted himself. Deven is here. I'm sure Deven's here. And also, there's Deven. And also, Bill, would you like to say hello, Bill, and also tell everybody just briefly about your organisation?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Irvine. I run a company called Universal Credit Advice and Advocacy. But in my delinquent past, I was a head of housing, head of benefits and revenues. And further back, a welfare rights advisor. What I do nowadays is provide assistance to primarily landlords, social and private, and if need be, represent them at the first and tier tribunals and the upper tier tribunals, assuming I can't sort out the problem by negotiation with either local authorities or with DWP.
Brilliant. And Bill, I know that you've got some fantastic, you also run seminars on this particular topic that we're talking about today, and have a lot of detail, a lot of knowledge in this area. So I'm sure our attendees today are really interested in hearing what you have to say. Just before we move on, I very briefly, I skipped over a slide there about policy and practice and what we do, which is very unlike me. But for those of you who've never heard of us before or don't necessarily know a lot about us, we're an organisation that exists to make the welfare system simple to understand and to navigate, so that people can make the decisions that are right for them. And we have some products and software that we use to do that. We have some analytics work with our Lift dashboard, and we also have our award-winning benefit and budgeting calculator. And Zoe's going to talk a little bit about that later on in the session today. So that's a very brief overview of who we are and what we do. So I think, sorry, Deven, if you could canter forward a tiny bit, thank you. Today's agenda, we're going to be looking, just nice, straightforward, simple agenda, and looking at the big picture. Deven's going to talk to us about the universal credit rollout, where we are at the moment, and some points to pick up on that, because there's been some movement in recent days. We're going to have a look at the current challenges facing social landlords and tenants, and this is, I think, where Bill is going to give a lot of information. We're also going to have a look at how some housing associations are meeting these challenges, and Zoe's going to talk about some of Policy and Practice's clients and how they're using, how they're meeting these challenges, and indeed technology that they're using to help them to do that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I think at this point we go into a poll. Deven, is that Is that correct? Over to Deven. Okay. Deven, it's over to you right now.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly, Deven. Over to you.
Great, sorry about that. I was on mute. Sorry, everyone. It's great to have so many of you on the webinar with us today. I think what I thought I wanted to do is just give everyone a bit of a background to what's happening with universal credit at the moment, particularly with the situation around rent arrears, with some recent research that was published just the other day by DWP. So I wanted to just get everyone onto the same page. And then I thought it'd be helpful to have a quick poll before we do a bit of a question and answer session with Bill and Zoe about the challenges that people are facing, landlords in particular are facing around arrears, and also the impact on their tenants and what can be done to help. So just briefly, I'll give a quick overview of the Universal Credit Roadmap. So this is a handout that you can download on the right-hand side. So if you go to handouts, I think you can download this. We keep these roadmaps up to date, so you get a sense of when policies are changing, which policies are changing, what's coming in when. You can see here that the rollout has been, in actual fact, there's the handout that you can download is a little bit updated to show that the rollout is being pushed back to 2023. So I think that's worthwhile. That's just worthwhile knowing, and it might just be worthwhile you guys downloading and accessing that. I've actually realized I've got the wrong presentation up, so I'm just going to pause for a quick second and pull up the more recent one. Sorry about that, Janet. It's very unprofessional, but just give me 1 second. Because I think there are a couple of slides that I just wanted to make sure you guys could see.
No problem, Deven. And I know that while you're getting that deck, there were a couple of changes that we had made to the rollout, the Universal Credit Roadmap, following the announcements, I think Thursday and Friday last week. And as you say, one of those was the extension through to 2023, which I think was quite interesting news. So while Deven gets the deck up, is there anything else that you'd picked up on the announcements of Universal Credit?
Yeah, hi Janet. I think what was interesting for me was the drop in benefit to universal credit. We've been looking at a lot of case studies of this, and one of the biggest ones, is nobody will be surprised out there, was people who receive severe disability premium, and it's good to know that they're going to remain on current benefits and until managed migration, so that they will get transitional protection. It does mean that somebody coming new onto benefits with disability won't have that protection, but it's a welcome addition. Mm-hmm. And the other group, one of the other groups we found that was going to be heavily impacted, was people who received tax credits but had over 16,000. There aren't many of these, but often these are people who've had insurance payouts because of terminal illness or something like that. Under current legislation, they get tax credits if they've got children. Under universal credit, they wouldn't have got any support. And there's some transitional protection for those people as well. So all this is welcome. And I think we're going to see more of this, these sort of changes around the edge, just to cushion the blow for certain people in the migration.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thanks, Zoe.
Can you guys see the slide deck now up and live?
Yeah, I can see. We can see the slide with the bigger agenda, Deven. It's a more scary looking agenda.
Fantastic. No, that's good. So I'll just I'll get back on track and give you a quick rollout update and some of that recent research as I'd mentioned. So sorry about the delay, everyone, but I think it's good to share some of this additional analysis that I was just reading up on over the last couple of days. So this is DWP research on the impact of universal credit on rent arrears. It was published just last week, so it's pretty up to date, and I think it's a good way to look at this. So a bit of context around the concerns that many of you will have had around the right of universal credit and rent arrears. So a fundamental aspect of both local housing allowance, when it was first introduced in 2008, and universal credit, is that payments go to the claimant and not the landlord in the first instance. So this isn't entirely new with universal credit, because it's been a phenomenon that's been true with some PRS tenants for some time, but the system itself is changing, and it is something that in particular is new to social landlords, and I know many of you on the webinar today are working in that sector. So some highlights from the service. You can see on the right hand side actually about almost a quarter of households are in housing arrears and not keeping up with bills and commitments based on qualitative research that the DWP commissioned. So a bit more detail behind that. Just over a third of universal credit recipients were experiencing housing payment arrears. And importantly, for 44%, the situation had deteriorated. So it wasn't necessarily getting better for all, it was getting better arguably for about half of them, but getting worse for about half of them too. And this is DWP's own research. So 1 in 3 claimants said the situation had improved. So about a third said it had gone better, but 44% had said it had gone worse. So there's still, despite some of the changes and mitigation, there are still some challenges in place. 2/3 said that they fell into debt after they made their claim for universal credit. So it's still definitely an area for concern. I'll talk a bit about the recent changes that were put in place, but I think it's definitely an area for, it's a timely webinar for landlords who are in areas where universal credit's about to roll out. A little bit more research though, initially, but again, ongoing from the DWP, households that were more likely to be in arrears, those with low household incomes of less than £10,000, those with long-term health conditions, those renting from social landlords. So social like those tenants in particular, I think are struggling with this change of managing their own money, and I imagine that's a key driver there. Those who have received an advance payment from Job Centre Plus in the last 3 months from before the survey was carried out. So I think that the advance payment helps, but it can also mean that it's harder to keep up payments later on. And those that have APAs, and there's a question around causality. So APAs is probably that's something that you put in place because people are going to be struggling to pay their rent. Some other research that's been published, there's been a few studies out there by Peabody and others, but one in particular I like that was commissioned by Southwark and Croydon councils was by the Smith report. Arrears stabilize. I like this because you can see in the chart they looked at the longitudinal impact. So it wasn't just immediately kind of a high level of arrears, but they looked at it over time. Where does it stabilize? So arrears do stabilize with time. So after around week 13, so after around 3 months, arrears seem to stabilize at around 6%. And it's around week 13 that people start to sort of, you see stable rental income, and some of those tenants start to pay back what they owed, but the actual kind of, they never seem to fully get back to paying it all back. Is I guess, a very serious concern. I think this level of quality of research is what DWP really respect and take on board. So being able to look at this stuff, not just in isolation, so spikes in arrears, but actually what's the long-term situation and how do you improve that? And then some recent changes that Bill and Zoe will speak about a little bit more, but in terms of the extent to which they are mitigating the effect. But recent changes to universal credit should improve the situation. And what we don't have in the data I just presented is data from when after the budget changes have been implemented and rolled out. So some really positive news, some of which we campaigned for, and we like to think we had a role in making happen. Ending the 7-day wait. So initially around universal credit, when you made a claim, there was a 7-day period where you were ineligible for any support. So that's ended. So you're eligible from the day you apply. Now, one of the implications of this is that you should be helping your tenants to apply immediately. A lot of people, because there's a 6-week wait for payment, might think that they can wait 6 weeks to apply. That's not the case, as you will know, is 6 weeks from when the application is made. So helping your tenants to apply early is a good thing to do. They've introduced a 2-week housing benefit run-on, which is really interesting. It's a really interesting way of solving some of these challenges in terms of the transition to universal credit. And I'm sure many of you will be relieved to know that of your tenants, when they move on to universal credit, there's effectively 2 weeks worth of rental payments that are paid in addition to. So if arrears are owed, that is a mechanism to reduce and tackle those arrears. If arrears aren't owed, then that goes into the tenant's credit balance effectively, and you can control that, or ultimately it should find its way back to the claimant, to the tenant. Then there's this idea of paying people in advance. So this idea of a 12-month repayment. So you can basically, and I've seen this in job centres, but certainly the advisors I was working with more after the budget changes were talking about advance payments, were letting people know about advance payments. So you can get a full month's universal credit paid almost on the same day, certainly within a couple of days of making a claim. The net impact is that this advance payment is repaid over 12 months, which reduces the monthly award after the fact. And I think Zoe will talk a bit about how we help people to budget around that later. Other changes that were introduced, so the taper has been reduced, so people moving into work get to keep more of what they earn. So that's gone from 65% to 63%, so effectively a 2% tax cut. Increases in the living wage are having a positive impact for those in work too. If you download the slide deck afterwards, you can click here and link into blogs that talk about universal credit on the front line. So we went to visit a few full service sites, and job centre advisors and local authorities and others talked about what they were doing to actually make the situation work well. You'll get a lot of this from Bill and Zoe in a second, but if you want to read a little bit more about that, then the blogs here are quite useful. And then some additional detail that, frankly, I think Zoe and Bill will be able to dive into much more detail. But there's new guidance for staff to ensure that claimants in the private rented sector can get their housing benefit paid directly to landlords. So they're given that option, which I think Bill can talk about a little bit more. And then protection for those losing out unfairly. So these were changes that were announced just last week. So those that were losing out unfairly through transitional protection, such as those that are transitioning, would lose the severe disability premium, or who are moving on to UC and going to be worse off because their earnings have changed by maybe as little as £5 a week, or their childcare costs have changed. They're going to continue to receive transitional protection. Protection for savers. So if you're transitioning across some tax credits, you've got savings above £16,000, you won't immediately be hit by a complete loss of entitlement. You will continue to be able to receive that for 12 months, and perhaps your savings will dwindle down, or you'll recognise. You certainly should be made aware that your eligibility will end after 12 months if your savings remain high. I think there's some serious issues with that policy, but I won't go into that too much. And a lot of this research on changes and improvements to universal credit have been backed by policy and practices work, both our analysis and leading lights type work, where we get frontline advisors together in forums like this to carry out polls or to communicate directly with policymakers. And if you're interested in that, please put your hand up or email Janet, hello@policyandpractice.co.uk if you'd like to share your experiences. And here's the updated universal credit roadmap in the new slide deck. So you can see that by March 2023, all claims should have migrated to universal credit, pushing back from 2022. And a couple of the other changes that were announced last week have already been factored into our benefit and budgeting calculator, which again, Zoe can talk a bit about. But we've got two experts on the line. So before I hand over to Bill initially, and then followed by Zoe, I wanted to just kick off with a poll. Janet, I'm not sure if you can launch this, but what is the single biggest issue you face with universal credit rollout? Is a good question to kick things off, and for Bill to think about as well.
Great, Deven, thank you. So thank you, everybody. What you should see now on the screen is the poll that Deven's mentioned. So what is the single, I know it's hard to just choose one, what is the single biggest issue you face with universal credit rollout? And your options are managing delays to payments, securing alternative payment arrangements, gaining explicit consent from tenants, getting tenants to pay, or is there something else that we haven't captured there? I can see everybody voting as we speak. Thank you very much. It's great to see neck and neck on a couple of points. I'll just give you a couple more seconds. We always do like putting our polls together, and I'm sure we know as well from attendees' point of view, you're always very interested to hear what other people's issues are as well, from looking up and out a little bit sometimes can be tricky. Great, I'm going to finish it there. Thank you very much. I'll close the poll now and I will share it on the screen. Deven, I'm hoping that you can see those results. Can you see them?
Shall I read them out?
Yeah, sure.
Just what's the single biggest issue you face with universal credit rollout? So managing delays to payments, 35%. So 1 in 3 of you thought that was the biggest issue. Getting tenants to pay is the biggest issue, with 44% of you saying that. 5% have said dealing with the explicit consent requirements. No one has said that securing alternative payment arrangements is the biggest issue, which is interesting. I guess it still is an issue from frontline conversations we've had, but perhaps not the biggest one. And 16% of you have said other. So of those of you that have said other, please pop in a comment in the chat box, and I think it's something that Janet can pick up on herself.
Absolutely.
If she wants to.
Absolutely. Great. Okay. Are you happy for me to close that poll now, Deven?
Yeah, I'm happy, and it'd be great, Bill, if you could kick off with any comments. So does that chime with you? So getting tenants to pay being the biggest issue, or delays to payments being, do those two sound like the biggest issues that you're dealing with when you think about the challenges facing social landlords?
Yeah, I mean, I think managing delays to payments is probably one of the main ones. If you look at your audience and look at the people that are sitting watching this, many of them have commented that their biggest interest was how to maximise the income for the tenants, but also maximise the income for the organisation. So it's not surprising that managing delays to payments would come into that and getting tenants to pay. One of the biggest issues just now with alternative payment arrangements, particularly the payment of that, because of the length of time it's taking for that first payment to arise, is that many housing associations and councils are actually saying to their tenants, look, we really need you now to make an effort to make payments, even though it might be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks before we receive the payment from DWP. We want you now to try and close that gap between the arrears that you've got just now and get back to where you were before you moved to universal credit. There's undoubtedly problems with the payment system from DWP because the payments are paid, as I'm sure most of people are aware, on a 4-weekly cycle, but they're actually paid monthly, so there's periods during which there'll be no payment at all, and that leads to technical arrears, and that means that when you go into court, if you were going for repossession, you would need to make sure that you're actually going for the actual arrears rather than including in that figure that you put into the court, the technical part of that. It's created by these archaic systems that DWP are still using.
So that's kind of interesting because I think there's a distinction here, as I think the Smith Commission made, between technical arrears, things that the tenant has very little control over, arguably because there's been a delay to payment or because there's been some confusion, and genuine arrears. And is that a distinction that you think housing associations make? Do you think it's right to expect housing associations to make that distinction between technical arrears and quote-unquote real arrears?
I think they have to, in terms of when they take legal action, you need to make sure it's a true arrear they're actually pursuing, not something that builds in something they're going to receive sometime down the line. The DWP have really challenged the whole approach to how you calculate an arrear. There was a case a number of years ago called, it's commonly known as the Coventry case. It was a first-tier tribunal that decided that the way you work out a rent arrear is to look at the date of liability. So if someone's due to pay a month's rent on the 1st of August and they don't pay it, that's the day later they're a month in arrears. And if they don't pay September's on the 1st of September, then the day later they're 2 months in arrears. Now DWP don't look at it like that. They look at the payment cycle. That's how they assess the arrear. And that was the old way of doing things up until that Coventry judgment. DWP took advice, legal advice, and agreed that the Coventry judgment was sound. So they're now taking a different role. In fact, Mr. Cowling tweeted that housing associations were being premature in pursuing rent arrear, and they were also pursuing a rent arrear that wasn't really a true arrear. But that was him basing it on the old way of doing things rather than the correct way of doing things.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I think this. I mean, certainly I followed your work for some time, Bill, and we've been speaking pretty much since I started policy in practice. So I mean, clearly you're someone who knows about the detail behind this. How has DWP's kind of the challenges DWP have faced as the universal credit has rolled out? How have those challenges changed, and what do you think their biggest challenges are at the moment in terms of getting payments made on time? And I'll talk a bit about the stats behind it as well in response.
Oh, I think first of all, before I get into that, I think the first thing is this rollout, the expansion of the rollout and the move to full service. For people who are sitting listening to this conversation and have been used to the live service, they would be probably thinking that when they move to full service, there won't be a big difference, but they'll find very quickly there is a big difference between the two. And if you think about the last 5 years, we've now got something like 900,000 people now claiming universal credit. Over the next 5 years, we're going to have another 6 million added to that at the very least. My biggest concerns with this is up until now, DWP have struggled getting the first 900,000. and not without a lot of problems for both tenants and housing associations. When we move to this accelerated rollout, and we're dealing with more complex cases, the live cases were, remember, single people invariably, and 70% of whom didn't have housing costs. We're now moving to a group of people who are more complex in terms of DWP, not as far as housing benefits concerned, because they've been dealing with them for 30 years, so for them it's relatively straightforward. But DWP find this challenging. Their staff simply don't know what they're doing in many instances. The staff who are contacting them from housing associations who've been training themselves on universal credit invariably actually know more than the DWP staff, so we need to correct that. We need to make sure that DWP staff are properly trained and they're properly resourced, and at this point in time that's not the case. My worry is if we expand this service very quickly over the next 4 or 5 years, these more complex cases, all we're going to face is more problems for tenants and also for the housing associations and the councils and the private landlords that I represent as we deal with these things.
I mean, that's a really helpful. So before we get into the challenges, I just want to bring Zoe into this for a second. Hi, Zoe. I just wanted to ask. I know you've been looking at for a project we're doing on supported housing. You've been looking in detail at the challenges people in supported housing face, and you've been looking at the kind of the day-to-day challenges compared to the guidance that's available for work coaches and benefit advisors. And I wondered whether there was anything you wanted to say about, you know, the gap between what the guidance allows and what's sometimes happening on the front line.
Yeah, what we did find on the research, and we did some quite extensive qualitative research, was that what was happening in practice was not exactly what the guidance had suggested. And I think this probably comes down to the point Bill raised about training and resources. And we're finding this so much more on the helpline, where people have phoned up about their claims and where they've talked to their work coaches. The work coaches seem to have a much better grasp on it. The training seems to be much more concentrated in the job centres. When people phone up the helpline, we are definitely finding that people aren't following necessarily the guidance. And if they are following the guidance, they're treating it as regulation. And I think some of this comes back to how universal credit was designed in the first place. It was designed to simplify. I mean, if you look at the UC regulations, they're so much smaller than all the benefits they're replacing, and so much more emphasis is given over to DWP decision makers, that they can decide. It's not set out in stone for them. And I think we're going to see this tightened over time through case law, because the problem is we've got challenges around that, and what is reasonable and what isn't reasonable. Yeah, so there is certainly a bit of difference between what's happening on the ground and what the guidance suggests DWP should be doing. And I'm thinking that perhaps this is because as it gets embedded, this will become, the decision makers will become a bit more aware of some of the guidance, their training will get better, and over time we might see these come together. We'll also obviously see case law influences.
Great. Really helpful, and I think clearly knowing that there's going to be a period where hopefully things get better, but recognizing that there are challenges right now is key. Bill, you've been working with housing associations up and down the country and helping them deal with their interactions with DWP. Is there anything, like, what would you say are the biggest challenges over and above the poll, so getting into one level of detail beyond that you see your social landlords facing in sorting out rent arrears?
I think the communication with DWP is one of the biggest problems they will face, because the communication lines at this point in time haven't really been great. We've been keeping us at arm's length, although there is moves now to actually give us details of who the local partnership managers are, who the district managers are, who the work coaches are, and giving us their contact details, their emails, and that will definitely improve the relationship between the organisation, because it's one thing to arrange a meeting and bring a social landlord or a private landlord along to that and tell them all the great things about this new benefit called universal credit. But the reality is, when you start to actually deal with DWP and the problems start to arise, they sometimes take umbrage to the idea of actually challenging what they're doing. Now, I've been doing this for 30 years. so I have no difficulty challenging it. But I had a case recently where one of my landlords, a social landlord at a housing association, I got a phone call asking why they had made so many complaints. And she said to them, she was a deputy director, said to them, the reason why we're making complaints is we're applying for payments coming to us and you're not doing it. We're writing to you, you're not responding. And if you don't respond, we're going to escalate. And what we have done is we've put in place a process now that actually deals with complaints and also with appeals. And as Zoe was saying there a minute ago there, that the regulations are okay, there's nothing difficult about those, nor the guidance. But the problem is that the DWP staff don't necessarily read those or don't have them explained to them. So I frequently point out to the hierarchy of DWP where they're going wrong. And some of the things they're getting wrong is bread and butter stuff. I mean, the overpayments is something that I'm sure your audience are familiar with, the housing benefit. Yeah. And we were told that under universal credit, overpayments would not be as big an issue. In fact, it's more of an issue. And I knew it would be right from the start as soon as I read the regulations, because we rely on, in the main, tenants responding to changes of circumstances by going onto their journal and reporting that. Now, there's a lot of people who will do that, but many people will not do that for a variety of reasons. And if they don't, or if they delay in doing that, that will create overpayments. And just about a month or so ago there, I found that there was 40,000 overpayment demands sent out by the DWP in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. And one of the cases actually went to one of my clients. They contacted me and said, what's all this about? And I phoned Northern Ireland. It's not my habit to phone DWP, I would normally write. I just was intrigued to find out why they were involved. And to cut a long story short, I found that they had sent out 40,000 invoices, but had never thought to send out a letter before that saying there's been an overpayment. Here's the overpayment period, here's the amount, and by the way, you've got a right to challenge this. And what they were doing was they were actually making demands simply because the housing association was receiving the payment direct. Now, the law basically says that in most cases where payments are paid to someone and an overpayment arises, then the overpayment will be recoverable from them. But in the case of where a landlord gets a payment and the cause of the overpayment is down to a failure on the part of the tenant to notify the DWP or delay in notifying, then it's the delay in notifying or the misrepresentation that causes that overpayment to be recoverable from the tenant rather than the landlord. But if you don't send out the letter, which you're legally obliged to, then there's something fundamentally flawed with that system. And we really need to start to raise the profile of some of these things. The other thing that we're finding is with third-party payments, for the rent arrears, what DWP seems to be doing is prioritising their own debts, one of which is overpayments. So that sometimes what's happening is there's a third-party payment in place for rent arrears, 10, 15 or 20%, and then all of a sudden it disappears, it stops being paid. And I've found out recently what they're doing is they're actually replacing it with their own overpayments or HMRC's overpayments. Now, in the pecking order, there's a hierarchy. Rent arrears is number one in the pecking order. Overpayments are down at 14, 15. So they should not be replacing the housing costs, but they are. And these are things that we're picking up and we're challenging. And what we really need is more housing associations and councils to start looking out for these things, because these all impact on rent arrears.
Yeah, and I think, that's a really... So go on, Zoe.
Sorry, I was just going to say that what Bill says absolutely chimes with what we found in the research, is that the overpayments and third-party deductions is something that the DWP really need to get a handle on. We were seeing that people were having recovery of amounts that are higher than the amount that is that they are able to recover because of this merging of debts from various different organisations. And there hadn't been a check to make sure that they were below the maximum that they were allowed to recover. I do think that Bill's absolutely right. I think that one of the areas, because DWP have been concentrating on the rollout, there are these things around the edges that haven't had the attention they need and probably will over time. But at the moment, if any of the audience's tenants have got recovery, ongoing recovery, it's always worth a look. It's always worth a look to see if it's being recovered at the right amount and to see if the priority of recovery is correct.
So before, I mean, that's really helpful. So before we move on to the kind of what you would advise housing associations to do, both Bill and Zoe, and perhaps Zoe, you can show landlords how we're helping them through some of this stuff. I just wanted to add on the overpayment side. I've been lucky enough to go to a couple of full service sites and a couple of service centres too, so on a couple of visits, and it's really interesting. What I found most useful, particularly with the service centre visits, is the decisions DWP make much more sense when you see how they're made. So when you look at kind of decisions they're making around overpayments, the decision makers don't necessarily, they've got what they've got to go on. So as Bill, as you said, if there's nothing in the journal that suggests anything else, it's almost, you know, do we take the full of, you know, why take a medium amount? I think there are sensible things DWP can do to better inform that, but it's just, I just wanted to make the point that you can see, while the system itself needs to improve, you can see kind of what within the system that there's room for the system itself to change. But back to you both, kind of before we move on to sort of Zoe's demonstration and the Q&A with the audience. Bill, are there any sort of things that you would say that you would recommend landlords do now in preparation or to deal with the rollout of universal credit to help ensure arrears are paid? And then Zoe, I'll hand over to you for a demonstration at that point as well.
I think moving to the full service, most of your audience will already be operating in a position where they've already made plans for this. I think it's important you do make plans. You don't assume that it's going to be the same as live service, because it's not. The good news is that the rollout isn't going to be big bang. There's going to be tranches. The first tranche will be your new claims over the next few months. And then next July, we're going to see the migration of existing claims. That's going to be a big challenge, because that means that people who are already claiming these legacy benefits will all of a sudden be told you're going to have to make a claim online for universal credit. These people should receive protection as well from transitional protection, but yeah, I'm really concerned that DWP might not be able to actually deal with the volumes, I was saying earlier on. But the DWP also need to start to engage with the housing associations in a much more meaningful way, and actually listen to the problems and try and address those problems. If you've got a welfare rights worker in your organisation, money advice, financial inclusion, I would say the best thing to do is to have a small team, have a welfare reform champion or universal credit champion, but a team of staff that are dedicated to get their heads around this new benefit, so they can then start to then give the information to their colleagues in different parts of the organisation. We've got 4 or 5 years to get to the end of this exercise, maybe even longer, I suspect. But the important thing is to look at your high-risk cases, which are your new claims. That'll be the first one. And then after that, look to support them as well. Do as much as you can to support your tenants, because the more you do, the more you invest, the more you will actually save problems further down the line. That's what I would recommend you do.
Okay, really helpful, and I think that idea of planning ahead and thinking about which tenants are higher risk is key. Zoe, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I'm going to see if I can make you a presenter. So this should work, and you guys should be able to see Zoe's screen in a second. It looks like it's working. So Zoe, over to you to talk a bit about tenants really, and how, for example, you know, we saw in the poll that a large group of people on this were worried about actually just getting the tenants to pay themselves. So, you know, I think you're going to walk people through a tool that is helping both tenants to understand what's changing and also the impact on how that can help advisors too. So over to you.
Thanks, Deven. Just going back to what Bill said, I think that the housing associations we've worked with, I think having welfare reform champions really does help. And the preparedness is key. It's where you've got people who actually know the benefit inside out and can assist tenants to actually maximise income and work with them in budgeting. And that allows people to be able to differentiate between those who can't pay arrears and those who just won't pay. So budgeting support, we've seen this in a lot of housing associations. They're taking more and more a role of this, and in the research we've just undertaken, all the housing association officers we were talking to were saying that they have really stepped up their budgeting support and introduced facilities to assist with claim and claim management. Although an awful lot of tenants out there are perfectly happy and they find the process straightforward, for people who have got certain barriers such as lack of IT knowledge, literacy issues, that the landlords are stepping in to assist these people with claiming and managing their claims. And one of the tools some of these housing associations are using is the calculator, and this allows tenants to have knowledge of what their benefit will be. We do know, there's been a lot of research on this, that actually knowledge is key, that probably about 60% of tenants can manage their claim, can manage budgeting if they know what they're going to get. If they don't know what they're going to get, they can start getting into a spiral of debt, and especially with that weight at the beginning. Once you're in debt, it's very difficult to get out of it, as those figures Deven showed at the beginning sort of illustrated. So with our calculator, the housing associations and landlords are using it. They put in the details of their tenants, usually working with the tenants, either because the tenants have come to their notice because of arrears, or just because the welfare rights team are trying to maximise the income of tenants and make their lives just that little bit better. What the calculator shows is how much benefit somebody should get. So, for example, this person here, we can see they would get £880 universal credit. They're earning. So you can see their total income. You can see if people are moving over to universal credit, you can give them warning of any change in their income. And this allows people to prepare and to budget. It's very difficult for people to wait 5 weeks not knowing what's going to be at the end of it. If you're housing an association that has a employment support, and this is particularly where people are benefit capped, and you can get them out of the cap by increasing their working hours, you can look at the situation now and you can easily show them the difference that will be made if they change employment and how much better off they would be. We also provide information about the case, and this is really important because welfare advisors within housing associations, this is usually an addition on top of their day job, which is a housing officer. They're looking at all sorts of housing related issues and they're trying to learn the whole welfare benefit system inside out at the same time. And like Bill, I've been many years within welfare benefits and I still have to look up regulations. So what we're trying to do is make personalised advice for people. So instead of having to read through reams of regulations and guidance around things that don't actually affect that particular tenant, you can immediately go to the advice that you would want to give people for their specific circumstances. So for this tenant, for example, they're affected by the bedroom tax, they may be able to get a DHP. It tells them about transitional protection and when it will apply or not. And it also tells them about different benefits they could get and different types of income that actually might maximise their income. So with this sort of knowledge, it really does help people make plans, but there will always be the need for budgeting support. And I think what Bill was talking there about arrears and managing monthly payments is certainly a challenge. In fact, I think of the research we did, apart from communication with DWP, it came across as the biggest challenge, not just for the landlord, but for the tenants. We have a budgeting element here, which landlords are using to enter information on the costs, people's costs, and then creating a summary so people can actually see where their money is going. For some people, this will be the first time they've done it. Because managing monthly payments is a lot different. Managing weekly payments, if it runs out, you might just have to wait 2 weeks. We actually saw some tenants who were spending all their money in the first week and just relying on free food or begging after that. And they're people who had particular vulnerabilities. That's not the norm. But in fact, there are people out there who could certainly benefit from just thinking a bit more about how the money is going to last for a month. So we show the income against outgoings. The colours are all designed so that the tenant will actually engage with the process. In fact, one housing association said that they'd had a tenant sitting back, not interested at all about budgeting. Somebody saw the colours and leant forward and were looking at the graph. So visualization is actually quite important in these conversations because they're tricky conversations to have. We also let people know if their costs are higher than similar sized households. And where costs are based on personal items, they can consider if there's any savings to be made here. And also if any method of paying electricity, gas or water could be changed to save money. So all in all, you can really assist your tenants. We also have an option whereby you can look at a budget and provide somebody with a budget where they can see their priority payments and non-priority payments. And this goes back to some of what Bill was talking about earlier about overpayments. It does say the maximum overpayment that recovered. It does say how much can be taken off via a sanction. And how much the maximum that can go to the landlord in advance. So it automatically calculates these amounts. So you can check against the amounts that somebody's having recovered about whether this is correct. And this produces a budget that the person can take away with them that shows them their total income, any deductions at source, in this case, some's going to the landlord, the priority payments they need to make after money's been deducted at source. In this case, they've had a discussion about rent arrears, they're slowly paying off their rent arrears, and other outgoings that aren't priority payments, and how much is left at the end. And this sort of information really does help people manage their universal credit claims. I think that's all I'll say about this at the moment. Deven, I'll pass back over to you. Hi, Deven, are you taking back control of the presentation?
Hi, I'm so sorry. Yes, I'll do that now. Hi. Hi, everyone. Zoe, thank you so much for that. I thought that was a really good summary. I know there's so much more you could say. I'm just going to switch back to me. So we were seeing a couple of things Zoe didn't share was around the universal credit calendar function that we've developed that allows you to tell people which months they're likely to get multiple, if they're paid for weekly in their job, that might mean they get paid so much that their universal credit falls in the subsequent month. So letting people know which months they are, and importantly, when that might cause their universal credit payment to fall to zero because they actually need to restart their claim the month after. So very practical things you can do to help make sure people are getting paid, know what they're getting paid, and are taking steps to increase their income. I'm just gonna give a quick shout out. So now we've got an opportunity for questions and answers, but I've got two more for Bill while you guys are typing in some additional questions, and then Janet can ask the questions on your behalf. But two quick ones for Bill that I know came up in the poll. So one was we had a sort of a small percentage of people saying actually explicit consent was a bit of an issue, and Zoe may want to comment on that too. And I don't know if there's anything you've been able to do to help landlords engage with DWP on this front, or if there's any advice you would give?
Yeah, I think I was partly responsible for getting it removed on the 20th of December because I've been raising complaints on behalf of landlords through the stages, the first, second stage of the internal process, but more recently through the independent case examiner. And 11 of those cases resulted in conversations between DWP and the independent case examiner. And ironically, the person in charge of complaints for DWP supported me and said that applying explicit consent to APAs was just ridiculous, because what was happening was we had private landlords who were losing £16,000 a case. Every month the payment was actually being made directly to the tenant, and the reason the DWP staff at local level couldn't transfer it to the landlord was because of this policy of explicit consent, which was completely absurd. And way back in 2015, DWP agreed with me at director level that they could, when an application was made for an APA and the money to be redirected to the landlord, the first thing they would do would be suspend payment. They've never suspended payment ever since. In fact, the new legal advice that they seem to be receiving is they can't do it, when in fact the regulation says they can actually pay in part or in whole the payment to the landlord, so they can't do it. But these are the challenging things. But this explicit consent will not stop here. Welfare rights workers, money advice workers, people dealing with tenants for many, many years have used implicit consent, and it's actually worked very, very well. if they know who they're dealing with, they should actually be able to share that information with the welfare rights worker, the money advice worker. But DWP are taking this to a different level, and they're really impeding and frustrating the welfare rights, the money advice people from actually representing the interest of their tenant. In many instances, when they actually phone up, even with the tenant alongside them, they have been denied the opportunity to actually speak, even though the tenant is actually given consent. So I think this explicit consent is going to cause major problems until DWP realise that they really need to be much more realistic about it and recognise, like they did with MPs, that there needs to be implied consent where there are mandates and where emails that say that I act on behalf of my client, my housing association tenant, and that should be sufficient, particularly if they're dealing with.
No, thanks for that, Bill. I think you know, the DWP's perspective on this, and I'll share mine in a second, is a real concern around sharing the wrong kind of data with the wrong kind of people, and really concerned about fraud, given what happened with tax credits, particularly early on, where there was a lot of money in the first couple of years where kind of gangs were kind of gaming the tax credit system. But equally, I think there's a big opportunity being missed, as I think you've just said there, Bill, where the DWP can work with and take a common sense approach to working with the welfare rights organisations to effectively help administer the claim as effectively as possible. I think that's
it's not for 30 years in housing benefit, and it's actually DWP who advises local authorities. It's DWP who produces the guidance manual that actually talks about how information can be shared. So I don't see why, if they can do it for 30 years under housing benefit, why they can't come up with a system that can be done equally with universal credit and taking on board the threats that you're talking about.
I think one of the points, if I may just bring in one of the questions from the audience, and hopefully it chimes with the conversation we're having right now, but one member has asked, do you think, any thoughts from the panel on the landlord portal, and if this has made a difference, if any?
I mean, I think the landlord portal is a work in progress, and I think it will in future actually be a big benefit. I think at the moment it's got limited assistance. What it does probably facilitates the redirection of the payment to the landlord, but I think it will improve as time goes on. I think the trusted partner status as well definitely improves things. I've got a client in the Wirral, one of the housing associations, Magenta, whose rent arrears under the live service were actually less than they were at the start of the exercise. How they're faring now under the full service remains to be seen. But I think having the portal and having the trusted partner status will definitely help.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would agree with that from the research that we've been carrying out and our work with the housing associations. It does help. It does need some development. It is in its very early stages. I think that it's very useful for housing associations in particular to know who's going on to universal credit, because they can intervene at that point with triage to see what support people needed. And some of the housing associations that are managing their arrears quite well are those who, as soon as they get the verification of rent, are undertaking that triage. I think the big issues are when APRAs are revoked. There is no information given, so somebody can be getting the money to them for a period, and because of this 13-week payment cycle that Bill referred to earlier, it could be 2 months before the landlord finds out. So yes, it's helpful, but it needs to go further.
Just a point picking up there on the APRA there, one of the attendees says, I got an email today saying we can't ask for an APRA to be stopped even though we have trusted partner status. Any thoughts?
Yeah, they can't. It comes down, yes. I mean, this is one of the issues we've got, is that the tenant can revoke the APRA without the landlord knowing, but the landlord can't. And I was speaking to a housing association that's having exactly the same problem. Bill, any thoughts?
Yes, yeah, I think the opposite. It's a discretion. The discretion lies with DWP, and the request can be made either by the tenant or by the housing association, and each should be able to make their own case for that. If you have a court order, for example, a case has been to court and it's been agreed with the court, the person will pay £5 a week to clear off their rent arrears, and that's sufficed to court, then I don't believe the DWP should be insisting on it. In fact, if you look at the APAs, it says the APAs are actually should be used as a kind of fallback, so that if somebody is able to make the payments themselves and can demonstrate that, there should be no need for that APA.
Yeah, sorry, Bill, I'm very conscious of time, and I have a few more questions on APAs as well. But I think what I'll say to everybody, thank you. I did ask you to give your questions, the harder the better. Sorry, panel. And I'm getting loads of excellent questions coming in. So what I'll say, we will run out of time, but we will get answers to you offline after the webinar if we don't get to your point right now. Can I quickly just move on to this question here, if I may, from somebody who says, is there a risk for housing associations where a customer could be in rent arrears, but they decide not to request a full sanction to help the customer financially, but then another company comes along and takes the remaining amount allowed under sanction, so the customer is no better off, and the housing association is now getting less than they could if they had just submitted a full sanction? Any thoughts on that?
I'll leave that to Zoe.
There is certainly a risk there. There is absolutely a risk there. I think that you've got to look at the priority that should be given. Really, I think that if you are not recovering all your arrears in one, you're not asking for full recovery, somebody else will get in there and get it. I think at the moment, housing associations are probably best. They should be number one in payback. So I think that you are risking that, and we've seen before that people who are in debt are generally in debt to many, many people. It's very unlikely that someone with rent arrears will not have somebody else who will be putting in for that deduction.
I mean, there is a conflict there. Sorry, just to build on that, there is a bit of a conflict there between that kind of advice, which I don't disagree with at all, but that and the kind of the concern that many of welfare rights people will have shown that of just the total amount being taken away. And I think there's I think it's the control around what can be taken away. That's obviously a bit more under universal credit than it has been historically. That perhaps needs to be controlled, particularly given some of the work that was done on destitution by Joseph Rowntree last week, which sort of said these kinds of things are what is driving people toward not really being able to make ends meet at all.
Yes, I think this, I suppose it comes down to, doesn't it, the relationship with the tenant, that actually it's probably worthwhile having a conversation with the tenant and asking what other debts are likely to be requested, so that you can make a decision about whether you put in for the full debt or not.
And that's a feature in the calculator as well that allows you to to understand the debts and therefore to do a kind of prioritization, Zoe.
I think the other interesting thing is that the courts will have a view on this. If you have somebody in rent arrears and the housing association or the council doesn't apply for an APA, yet they decide at some point to go for a repossession, then if they haven't exercised their right, to access the APA or access the third-party deduction, then the court may take an adverse view of that.
Yes, that's a very good point.
I have a lot, like I say, lots of other questions. If I may, I'm very conscious of time. If I may, I'll just end on this question, which kind of, when will things get better? It's a bit like you're going to have a crystal ball, but I suppose the point really is around timeframes. And Bill you talked about training and staff, and Zoe, you talked about case law. From the panel's point of view, do you have an idea or do you have an opinion on the time frame that we're looking at here now, when things are going to get better?
I think we're going to.
Oh, sorry, Bill, you go first.
I think we're going to have stormy waters for quite some time, actually. But like all storms, eventually there's a calm. But it may well take another 3 or 4 years before we'll see the real effect of universal credit. I was an advocate for universal credit, and to some extent still am. My biggest concern remains not the regulations or the guidance or anything like that. It's actually the DWP's administration, and unless they do that, then this could take a while for it to bed itself and improve.
Yes, and I would agree. It's certainly going to be stormy waters for a while. I'd be a bit more optimistic, because I think just because from areas that have had rollout full rollout for a while, they are seeing differences. They are, I mean, certainly in the JCPs, and a lot of this is the interaction with local authorities and training at JCPs. The training of work coaches, I think, has been accelerated. There is certainly more support for vulnerable tenants within JCPs. There is certainly more training being given to work coaches in how to advise those with complex needs. And all this is coming quite quickly. I think there is definitely a resource problem at DWP, but we've had some meetings at Policy and Practice with DWP, and they're certainly in listening mode at the moment. I think how they put it to us was that the push was to get the train on the tracks, and now they want to make sure it goes well. So I think that there's been a huge emphasis on just getting this out there. And what I'm hoping is that people like Bill and all the housing associations and all the advocates for tenants and claimants will be working with DWP, so all this stuff around the edges can be just dealt with to make things easier. And certainly that comes back to the implicit consent that we were talking about earlier.
I agree with a lot of what you've just said there, but I would say that the last 4 or 5 years, housing associations and councils have done nothing other than help the DWP. It's only recently that DWP have started to listen.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a decent summary of the situation. So I don't have too much more to add to that. I have been just to reiterate, I think that the focus has historically been on just getting universal credit on the road in quite a sort of inward-looking, let's get the program up and running way. And I'm reassured a little to see the fact that the level of engagement outbound listening is happening a little bit more, and you are starting to see changes to the budget changes I mentioned before. And some of the changes that were announced last week, for example, which shows that they are listening and dealing with issues as they are in the priority ways in which they are raised. I think we all want them to be going further, faster, particularly as you say with Rollout accelerating Bill. I think there are going to be, hopefully for those that are on this webinar, we're very keen that you keep the conversation going. Our influence is informed partly by, in large part, just by working directly with yourselves. And giving people a sense of actually what the detail of the issues are, and helping you to think about ways in which they can be resolved and getting those solutions heard at the top table. So that seems like a good point to end on, Janet, unless there are any other, I'm sure there are other questions, but we'll follow up with each of you, and we're keen to sort of wrap up when we said we would.
Absolutely.
So Janet, do you want to go through the next steps?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've said that point exactly to the audience. We haven't got to everybody, but we will offline. So thank you very much. Deven mentioned at the top of the webinar that there are a couple of downloads on the right-hand side, a bit of information about the calculator that our award-winning calculator that Zoe demoed a few features from. You can find a flyer there about that. And also the Universal Credit Roadmap. That's a PDF, and you can take that and print it off and put it up. We update that on a regular basis as and when changes occur. Immediately after the webinar, there'll be a very short survey. It'll come up on your screen once I close the webinar. Be ever so grateful if you could give us your feedback. Let us know whether what we covered was correct. Any other questions for today's panel? Let us know if you want your own look at the calculator that Zoe went through. Most importantly, I suppose, please put your hand up and say if you'd like further Q&A conversation with Bill and Zoe. This is such a massive area, so many topics really just kind of touched on. Bill and Zoe have put themselves available to people. We're just looking to see whether we would hold a face-to-face seminar. So we'd look to see your interest in that. So please do take the time to fill in that survey. Thank you very much. We are slightly over time. I do hope you agree it was worth it. Some brilliant conversations had today. You can contact Zoe and Bill. And also, Deven, sorry, I missed you off here, but you can contact our panel using these email addresses. And indeed, if you call Policy and Practice head office, we can put you directly in touch with Bill, or indeed just go to Bill's website as well, and you can get hold of him that way. So that just all that remains is me to say thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance. It's been great to see such a dynamic and well-attended webinar, and I think that just goes to show how important the topic is. So thank you very much, everybody. You'll get the slides and the recording shortly in a follow-up email. So all that remains is for me to say thank you and have a great rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.